One of the single most influential things that someone ever told me was that someone I trusted had hurt them. Specifically, it was a friend I'd met through school, and the person was her stepfather. The worst part was, I used to think he was a good guy. He was affable, told bad jokes, and his wife made the most amazing German cooking. I remember thinking she was lucky. Obviously, she wasn't. She told me in my third year of college over Christmas break, and the first thing I did was cross two provinces to be there for her in person. But I'll be honest, at the time, I was conflicted. I couldn't reconcile the person I'd experienced with what she said he'd done. I stayed in a spare room at her mother's house, and she dragged me out to a bar where I learned that the drunker people get, the less likely they are to understand my jokes. And she spent a lot of time with a cute but very skeezy guy who came from a local wealthy family. My friend was clearly hurt and acting erratically. Now I realized that her behavior that scared me and I worried was self destructive was because she had been repressing everything that she felt in order to conform to the expectations in the controlling home she'd been raised in. In going public about what her stepdad had done, she'd freed herself from him, but the burden of his control had been exhausting, smothering. In freeing herself from the silence and shame that he'd trapped her in, she found herself unsure of why she did anything, and she started saying yes to everything because she'd never truly been able to freely choose anything in her life. I had to head back to school for the winter semester, but I had difficulty focusing on my classwork. Many days I would head to the library and read books from the abnormal psychology section because I needed to understand why someone would do something like that. And could my friend's stepfather truly have done that? Spoiler alert, yes, he very much fits the profile. I didn't doubt her, but there is this human compulsion to suggest that the most trustworthy people in any situation are the ones who are going about things in an orderly fashion and following all the rules, right? My friend wasn't doing that, but I'd never known her to be a liar. There's a certain type of church kid that just never learns to lie, and game recognized game. So I read. I read what I'd later learn were case studies. I read more generalized books. I probably strained my neck because I'd always put the book flat in my lap and read it so that nobody could see the cover and ask why on earth I was reading about those kinds of people. To that, I had been a rather sheltered church kid, and in the 90s, I'd often heard people claim loudly that gay people were dangerous to kids, and I knew that I was gay, and I hadn't ever tried to be gay. I just ended up that way. I had no desire to hurt a kid, but what if there was some kind of switch that would flip itself like a second awful puberty? I was more scared of that than I it was a very abnormal fear, but again, I had no idea why anyone would want to do that. So I kept reading, and I read about the sort of people you'd hear about on Law and Order SVU, and I also read about the sort of people that you'd hear about on normal Law and Order. Specifically, the sort of people who compulsively feel a want to do the sort of things that get made into Law and Order episodes. I remember learning that the overwhelming majority, regardless of the gender they harm, tend to identify as straight because puberty is a major factor. But the biggest single factor in terms of whether or not someone enjoyed harming someone else was a need for control. Control, control, control. That's what they wanted. Universally, that's what every single one of them wanted. They don't like anyone having personal freedom. For those sorts of people, the vulnerability was a huge factor, though in each individual, there'd also be a number of factors that would contribute to how things got expressed. But the need for control was the single biggest common factor across all cases. What the other person wants is not a factor that is important to the person who wants to hurt people. And I know it might seem strange, but learning this massively changed how I looked at morality and ethics and everything. It was like my eyes were open with this new lens that I found myself analyzing in everyday social situations. I started paying so much closer attention to everyone around me and noticing that the kindest people were universally non controlling. Now, that didn't mean that they were necessarily pushovers, but while their expectations on themselves could be high or low, their expectations on others were generally not high. General rule of thumb for these sorts of people was as long as you weren't hurting anyone, they'd let you be. But other people, the less kind ones, the ones who made you feel less at ease around them, the ones who were willing to push you out of a group in order to secure their place, they had a much higher set of expectations for other people. They didn't make suggestions. If they said please, it was a threat. They were the ones who felt a need to punish people. And this has proven to be a really useful piece of knowledge throughout my life. It took a while to really learn to recognize the signs that someone craved control. It was not always obvious. Sometimes they seemed okay. Sometimes I found them entertaining, or at least felt like they were on the same page when it came to my values. But eventually, something would happen. They'd get deregulated, and the mask would slip. And they didn't need to protect anyone. They didn't need to speak truth to power. They they just needed to hurt someone. And it turned out a lot of the time that person was me. So just remember the next time you see someone who needs you to do things their way. Sometimes there can be a good reason, but very often the reason is just an unhealthy need for control. Just maybe not as far along the spectrum as some people's.